Good afternoon. To use the term Canada's most versatile psychologist is rather extreme, but I hope to prove my point here. Peter Suedfeld is presently Dean Emeritus of Graduate Studies and Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Most of his research focuses on adaptation to and coping with extreme and unusual environments. He's published a dozen books and approximately 300 articles on such diverse topics as polar and space psychology, sensory deprivation experiments, scoring techniques for oral history records such as Holocaust and genocide survivors, political psychology, health psychology, brainwashing and torture, and the social psychology of attitude and behavior change. I first knew Peter when he was chair of psychology at Rutgers, but we didn't really connect until about 15 years ago at CPA. Born in Budapest in Hungary in 1935 to a thoroughly assimilated Hungarian Jewish family, he was the only child of his generation. His father was a cellist in a symphony orchestra and also played the saxophone and clarinet in dance bands. During the summer, he would spend time with the Army Reserves. His mother, Joanne, worked as a legal secretary. There was a large extended family with grandparents, uncles, aunts, and older cousins. The family attended a synagogue instead of a church, but other than that, he was no different from his other Hungarian friends. He never even heard of the word Yiddish or had even eaten a bagel till he emigrated to New York City after the war. At least 4 generations of Suedfeld male ancestors had spent significant time serving their country as soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars, the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, World War I, and various Balkan squabbles. The family was Jewish but had strong Hungarian roots. When Hungary allied itself with the German Axis, anti-Semitism forced Jewish citizens to be ostracized from Gentiles. When Peter was 7 years old, he had to wear a yellow star, live in a specially marked house, was not able to attend school or Cub Scouts, and had to stay away from playgrounds and former playmates. His father had been a first sergeant of a machine gun company in the Hungarian Reserve, but with the Nazi takeover and as a Jewish man, he was disarmed. His uniform was replaced by a cap and an armband, and he was transferred to a forced labor camp in 1942. His mother was arrested in 1944 and with tears in her eyes was taken away from him and sent to a holding camp. At only 39 years old, she was eventually shipped to Auschwitz and never heard from again. During the German occupation in 1944, the Arrow Cross Party and Hungarian police deported nearly over 400,000 Jews, mostly to Auschwitz. In less than 1 year, about 2/3 of the estimated 825,000 Jews in Hungarian-controlled Romania were killed in concentration camps or ghettos. By the end of December 1944, the Soviets encircled the capital city, beginning the 2-month-long Battle of Budapest. The Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg managed to save a considerable number of Hungarian Jews by giving them Swedish passports. But when the Soviets arrived, he was arrested as a spy and disappeared. It should be noted that the war also left Hungary devastated, destroying over 60% of the economy and causing a huge loss of life. Here's a picture of Peter at 7 or 8 years old wearing a Jewish star you can see in the corner. This was a humiliating experience for Suedfeld, and he reacted with anger. He started cheering for the Allied air raids on Budapest, would make rude gestures at uniformed Arrow Cross militiamen, and stubbornly refused a last-minute conversion to Catholicism that might save him from persecution. His relatives' fate during the Holocaust varied. His father labor unit was transferred to the Western Front, and then he was sent to the Mauthausen concentration camp, which is used mostly for extermination through labor of the intelligentsia. Eventually, by the end of the war, his father was liberated by the US Army. After his mother's arrest, Peter was taken in by his mother's sister, with whom he lived for several months. The war was intensified, and Budapest was subject to almost constant bombardment. They spent much of their time in the cellar of their apartment, and Jews were not allowed in public air raid shelters. They're also not allowed to ride in public transportation, use public facilities such as parks, hold jobs, own businesses, attend school, go to a hospital, or even participate in social organizations. When the Jewish population of Budapest was ordered to prepare for evacuation, his aunt found a former employee who was a Christian and was willing to smuggle him to safety. Safety in this case was an orphanage run by the International Red Cross, and the all-female staff equipped them with false Christian papers, aliases, and trained them to avoid detection. He was drilled in his new identity and taught how to behave as a Roman Catholic. A few months after his arrival, the Soviet army began the siege of Budapest, which had been considered one of the most frightful sieges of World War II. During the siege, he was moved continually around, scavenged for food, and tried to steal from packages parachuted to the defending German and Hungarian troops. They lived in unheated, unlighted basements, and they passed the time playing games or listening to stories and huddling close together at night for warmth. The orphan children were finally liberated in the winter of 1945 when a Russian infantryman threw open the door to their cellar. In the next few months, their material condition improved greatly, but Peter's emotional state worsened as more and more children were retrieved by relatives, but no one came for him. Even if any of his family survived, they might have not recognized him under his false name, Sugar Peter, since the location was far from the original orphanage building. He'd almost given up hope when he saw his aunt walking up the street. The sight of her and the large basket of food she was carrying was a joyous moment in his life. His father made contact and obtained a job with a band playing in the American NCO club in Vienna. His mother, Jolanne's last letter, smuggled from the holding camp before she was sent to Auschwitz, begged her husband to take their son out of Hungary. Late in 1945, he and his father sneaked into Austria by climbing in and out of various train windows and then took up residence in Vienna. He was sent to a boarding school, but when the other boys noticed he was circumcised, he endured taunts and fistfights from the Nazi-indoctrinated teenage boys. Eventually, American visas arrived, and they took a cattle car trip to Bremen, and then a seasick voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. His father stepped aside on the gangplank so Peter could be the first to set foot on his new homeland. For the next 4 years, they lived in Harlem and New York City, where he attended some public schools. He was able to complete a 3-year middle school course in 2 years, while at the same time learning English. His father was often away playing in bands, while Peter was again a minority because he was Caucasian as well as foreign and Jewish. Eventually, his father gave up hoping his wife would reappear and remarried, but his new stepmother didn't want Peter to live with them, so again he was boarded out. This couple took an interest in him and encouraged his reading and schoolwork. He passed the test for Stuyvesant High School, a science-oriented public school, and he then entered Queens College in New York City. His ambition was always to become a career military officer, but he was disqualified from attending due to poor eyesight. He dropped out of college after a year and a half, did infantry training in Fort Dix in Texas, and then sent overseas to the Philippines. Due to his occupation experiences during World War II, he was determined never again to be a defenseless victim. When he returned to school, he became an ROTC cadet commander of his unit and readied himself for active service. But in his last term at Queens, he took a required course in experimental psychology from Alice Lasker, and the textbook was the classic Experimental Psychology by Woodworth and Schlossberg. This was more of a graduate text and covered all the major areas of interest to psychologists at the time. The class was encouraged to devise and run small experiments and collect some data. This was the first time he was exposed to the real point of research, not to learn what is known, but to discover the unknown. Suedfeld found that the influence a teacher has on students doesn't depend on being famous or a specialist. What was important is to pass on a sense of intellectual adventure and enthusiasm. A year after he went back to school, Peter met his first wife at a party at Queens. By the time he went to Princeton, they had become engaged and then lived in graduate student housing, which was basically World War II Quonset huts. Suedfeld was an officer in the Air Force Reserve and stayed in the reserves until he decided to accept a job offer from UBC. Upon graduating from Queens, Suedfeld obtained a waiver of active duty commitment because he had already served. Using the GI Bill, he was able to gain admission to Queens and thought that he might be turfed out after the first year because he had skated through psych courses so easily at Queens. But he sought out professors who were doing research off the beaten path, things like Sylvan Tompkins, who is a well-known personality theorist, Jack Vernon, who'd studied hearing, including echolocation in bats, and Harold Schroeder, who became famous for high-performance managers in business. After graduating, he spent a year at the University of Illinois in Champaign, and then was offered a position at psychology at Rutgers. Many of his friends there were people outside the department, so he had a real cross-disciplinary flavor. In '67, he was promoted to associate professor, made chair of the psychology department, taught a variety of classes. He preferred smaller classes of 30 or less. He started sensory deprivation research on habit modification, such as smoking cessation, and started research on cognitive complexity. During much of Suedfeld's career as a professor, he had trouble answering the question, what area of psychology are you most interested in? Semi-facetiously, he labeled himself as a cognitive, experimental, social, environmental, political health, and personality psychologist. In effect, Suedfeld was a generalist whose long-term interests spanned all these areas. At grad school, he started doing sensory deprivation experiments, and at that time, it was regarded as very stressful. People reported hallucinations, anxiety, temporary psychosis. A lot of these studies had begun at McGill in the 1950s and involved subjects lying in a bed wearing cardboard cuffs and gloves. An article called The Pathology of Boredom in Scientific America appeared to label the research as either dangerous or not effective. However, using flotation tanks as a method was a major breakthrough. Contrary to popular belief, Suedfeld found that reduced sensory impressions are neither generally aversive nor damaging the cognitive processes. In fact, it leads to enhanced performance of some intellectual functions and perceptual motor skills. This is an early sensory deprivation tank. Here's a description of what it's like. Its origins were actually from John Lilly, who had a hypothesis that unless there was outside stimulation, the brain might go to sleep. Suedfeld, when he went to British Columbia, renamed the technique restricted environmental stimulation therapy to relieve the stigma. Here's a typical tank here. His interest in rest eventually led to field research on prisoners in solitary confinement, on workers in Arctic and Antarctic stations, and on review papers on solitude, loneliness, extreme and unusual environments, space travel, and altered states of consciousness. His findings have emphasized the incorrectness of catastrophic assumptions popular among both the general public and psychologists. Suedfeld found that most individuals cope quite well with such environments and are able not only to overcome but to enjoy the benefit from encounter with these things. Even convicts in solitary confinement do not find restriction and social isolation to be intolerable. In '72, he received a call to go to the University of British Columbia. Rapid strides in psychology were made during his tenure. There's one of the first buildings. Before 1965, psychology was scattered across the campus. Professors and students had to rush from one building to the other, often in the rain. Suedfeld worked to build one building so psychology could be in one place, and in 1961, the Kenny Building was opened. Offices were arranged so faculty from different areas of psychology were placed next to each other to help foster cross-disciplinary collaboration. Suedfeld set about to organize an environmental psychology section. He had already worked in sensory deprivation. The new environmental section studied a wide range of topics such as the effects of traffic and airplane noise, psychological aspects of architecture and urban planning, the perception of wilderness and urban green areas, people's preference for different kinds of scenery, and how the environment affects people's feelings of being safe from crime. A small part of the work involved work on extreme and unusual environments such as solitary confinement in prisons, long-duration sea voyages, and space flight. He also tried to set up a department that was more research-oriented and improved teaching methods. Suedfeld became president of CPA in 1998, and during that time he worked with Martin Seligman to co-found the American-Canadian Psychological Association on ethno-political warfare. A part of this involves the study of the roles of leaders in propaganda and to encompass the effects of such conflict on individuals and groups, the way to reduce the intensity of the conflict, and means to assist people in post-war adjustment. Suedfeld's research became more diversified over time. He's analyzed the dimensions of thinking and decision-making to develop the concept of integrative complexity. This technique has been applied to the study of decision-making among high-level political, diplomatic, and military leaders, intellectual and artistic elites, and ordinary citizens. Another area has been the application of quantitative content analytical methods to study oral history records such as survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. And this has expanded to the narratives of people who have experienced other traumatic situations such as genocide. The interviews are usually content analyzed, and one important finding supports Suedfeld's general philosophy that human beings are more resilient than is typically believed. He also worked on a polar psychology project in both the Arctic and the Antarctic and studied the kinds of isolated and difficult living conditions that people could work through. He also worked with the Canadian Space Agency on how astronauts could adapt to longer time periods in space. He's probably most famous for his article called Homo Invictus, the Indomitable Species. If one were to identify a common theme, it'd be how human beings react to and cope with events that range from the unpleasant to the catastrophic. While colleagues were concentrating on the aversive consequences, his research showed the results interpretations revealed that these experiences and environments were also had pleasant features and favorable outcomes. In addition, many participants believe that they reported positive characteristics along with negative ones. Stressful experience he studied included both novel and life-threatening, reduced sensory input, living in remote and isolated capsules such as polar and space stations, solitary confinement, and being the target of genocidal persecution. His conclusion was most survivors have demonstrated surprising ability to endure, recover from, and overcome, even by strengthened by events that lead to outside observers seem overwhelming and destructive. His family today, there's some things on his personal life and meeting his wife Phyllis Johnson in September 1978 was one of his very good experiences. Here's a picture of his marriage, the collaboration between psychology and sociology departments. He does have some hobbies. He resists the term workaholic since he says it's just a matter of how you don't sleep too much. He's received awards too numerous to mention, but most recently the Gold Medal Award from CPA for lifetime contributions to Canadian psychology and the Diamond Jubilee Medal from Queen Elizabeth II. Here's his coat of arms. The psychology department at UBC today is considered the top department in Canada and the 12th in the world. It now has 51 full faculty members, 115 full-time graduate students, and about 2,000 undergrads. And 300 articles. I only have a few selected references, but I'd like to honor Peter Suedfeld and his contributions to Canadian psychology. And, you know, he may never get tenure today because you're supposed to just specialize in one area, right? But Peter has done what most people are told not to do today and sort of rode off in all directions at once. So thank you very much.